Welcome to the second episode in the second season of Justice Center Weekly, a podcast from the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. I'm your host, Kevin Steele, and with me today is lawyer Glenn Blackett. Glenn has been involved in many cases that have, at their core, the silencing of professional dissent. He was co-counsel for Leah McInnes, who had been investigated and hauled before the College of Registered Nurses of Saskatchewan, facing a charge of professional misconduct for allegedly spreading misinformation. The charge was based on her participation in public protests against government lockdown policies during COVID. Not incidentally, the charges were dismissed. Glenn's written columns like Wokeness Captures Alberta Law Society for the Western Standard. He's also involved in the case of Professor Frances Woodison, who is suing the University of Lethbridge for the cancellation of her scheduled speech titled, How Wokeism Threatens Academic Freedom. Glenn, there's been a lot of discussion about the silencing of professional dissent in recent years. For instance, Jordan Peterson. The debate seemed to intensify during COVID, with colleges punishing doctors and nurses for spreading quote-unquote misinformation. Glenn, do you think that people are starting to understand that we have a significant problem here?
Yes, I think that people are starting to understand we have a significant problem. I'm not sure that people fully understand the majesty of that problem. I see it as a much bigger problem than just the silencing of dissent, although the silencing of professional dissent is a huge problem that I think undermines the basically the integrity of the professions. But I would say it's broader than that, and that is to try to simplify it as much as possible, the politicization of the professions. And censorship is but one aspect of that politicization, but the politicization runs much deeper and is a thoroughly corrupting influence, in my opinion.
So you're saying that this silencing of dissent then is kind of like the outcome of this other thing that you see in the background. Maybe you could just describe a little bit of that. What's happening to the professions?
Well, each profession is unique, so they each kind of suffer their own manifestation of this. But if we were to look at, the medical professions, for example, I think that it's fair to say that the regulators of medical professions and the vast majority of professionals in the medical professions viewed their role in the pandemic as being to support public health, which is a fine thing to want to support. No problem. I have no problem exactly with doctors wanting to support public health, but ultimately a doctor is a professional, and the essence of a professional's role is to serve patients or to serve clients. And so while it's laudable for a doctor to want to support public health, their first and foremost and really almost sole interest when they're performing their capacity as a doctor for patients is to ensure that the patient is served properly and to ensure that they are fighting in every way for the interests of their patient alone. And so, while I think it's good that doctors, like any members of the community, support public health, the problem becomes when that support of public health starts to interfere with the doctor's relationship with the patient, which I think it did significantly during the pandemic.
Okay, so the politicization comes about because they are supporting public health, and that's a somewhat political role. Is that what you're saying? Because I wonder how this would translate over to another profession. Are they unique, completely unique, or are they kind of have at their core something common? That's where I was going with this.
Yeah, well, I first of all, I would say that the example of supporting public health is one, and maybe politicization seems like an odd adjective to apply, but or verb, whatever that is. But there are other aspects of professional regulation of doctors, which is more overtly and obviously political as well. So, yes, I would say that supporting public health, especially where you're subordinating patient interests to public health, That I would call politicization. But also, if you look at the Code of Professional Ethics for doctors, and I expect every medical professional in Canada, they all contain new values where doctors, as part of their ethical code, are required to be woke. And wokeness is, of course, a highly political concept.
Yeah, I think I found that somewhat involved in all the professions that I was looking at as I was preparing for this conversation. We were talking, you had written about wokeness in the Law Society of Alberta, and you have talked about it with Professor Widdowson. So I guess you see it now in the medical professions as well. Is that our common core here? Is that our problem here, that the wokeness at the base of it all? This is the politicization?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is the wokeness. The wokeness is what's driving it. But I think the fundamental problem is that the concept of the professional is being inverted. It used to be that the patient would go to the professional, or the client would go to the professional, and it was a relationship of trust and service, where the professional had absolute loyalty to their client or patient, and they did everything they could to uphold their duties of competence and ethics in that relationship with the patient. And external interests really didn't weigh heavily on that relationship. Now we seem to be migrating to a new concept of professionalism, where professionals become agents of other interests. So, and this is the point I try to make when I'm talking about the Law Society. The Law Society, by saying to lawyers that, lawyers have to be woke and you have to be pursuing woke objectives, is effectively saying that the lawyer, is supposed to be pursuing those interests. And the question becomes, well, if I'm pursuing those interests, what do I do when I'm in a relationship with a client? Do I pursue those interests in my relationship with clients? And it seems to me inescapable that yes, you do. So instead of serving the client, you're now serving a different master. You're serving a political master. And so it becomes this kind of weird top-down relationship, where instead of the regulator ensuring that the professional is competent and ethical and stays within some, general guidelines when they're providing service to their clients, instead you have sort of a top-down command structure where the professional is really just implementing the wishes of a different, of a third party, effectively. So the professional, instead of being the agent of the agent of the client, becomes the agent of whatever political interest they're being compelled to adopt.
And they do
if
this.
That makes any sense.
Yeah. Do they do this by changing the ethics, or they do it by what methods?
Yeah, lots of different ways. I mean, it comes at you from all sides.
Okay.
Ethics is one of them. We have, in competence is another one. In Alberta, lawyers, mandatory training is another one. So lawyers in Alberta were required in 2022, basically, to go through, woke indoctrination called the Path, which told us that, our Constitution is corrupted by racism. And I think encouraged us to change the way we practice as lawyers, change the way we interact with clients, change our perception of the law and what's legally appropriate. So that's one way it comes at us. The other way it comes at us as lawyers is through a new professional development profile, where the Law Society purports to tell us what a competent lawyer looks like. And as part of being a competent lawyer, you're an anti-racist. And I mean, for people that don't know what anti-racism means, effectively it means racism. It doesn't mean anti-racism. It means racism. It means accepting the whole woke worldview. So that's dressed up as a form of competence. And then they've also changed the Code of Professional Conduct, which was clearly an ethical guide, to encapsulate some woke concepts. And so it comes at us through ethics. And eventually it will be coming at lawyers. It comes at us in court. The judiciary itself has adopted wokeness in Alberta, and I think across Canada. the judiciary has adopted wokeness as one of the pillars of their strategic plans. So the court has decided that they need to incorporate wokeness into the courtroom. So when you go into court, you're going to be interfered with through wokeness. And the worst examples you see of that right now, although it doesn't seem terribly bad, but if you really think through it, it is quite bad, is the requirement in some jurisdictions and courts to state your pronouns. And that's, there was a case in BC where that same concept of, not misgendering people was applied in the context of basically a custody fight over a child who was or was not going to be in the custody of a parent that wanted them to get hormone replacement therapy. So you end up just by, using the proper pronouns in the court, sort of prejudging the case. And so it comes at you from all angles.
Right. I guess the main harm then is, as in the doctor-patient relationship, this inversion then. This inversion does happen across the professions, right? Basically, where they're supposed to be serving the client, they are now serving another master. I'm just trying, I guess I'm looking for commonalities here, and that's the one.
I think that's right. That would be the through line, is this sort of service of another master rather than your client would be the through line, I think. Yeah. There's more to it than that, but that's certainly the essential feature which I see is connecting a lot of this.
Right. And is there a way to push back against it? I know that you have been through writing and talking about it. I know that you were on a podcast with Dr. Francis Widdowson discussing these issues. Do you see a way to push back on these? Is it through the courts or is it through the media? Exactly how would you see a pushback occurring? I think
it's, it comes at you from all angles. You got to push back against it at all angles,
Okay.
I think a lot of, I think we're being we're being slowly shoved off of a bit of not a bit. We're being shoved off a civilizational cliff. And the reason that we're so easy to be shoved around is because we're Canadians and maybe Westerners, and so we're polite and we don't like to say rude things and we don't like to make a scene, and we're humans. We don't want to be outcasts, and so it's very uncomfortable and this brings us back to the topic at hand, to dissent. It's very uncomfortable for, most people. I don't find it all that uncomfortable, but most people find it quite uncomfortable to, for example, oppose any woke program at all. Because if you're, I just said, I think anti-racism is racism. Most people wouldn't, when asked in public, whether or not they're an anti-racist, wouldn't want to say, no, I'm not an anti-racist. They wouldn't want to say that. And they wouldn't want to say, I think anti-racism is racist. They wouldn't want to say that. And they wouldn't want to oppose things because it makes you look like a racist and a jerk. And Canadians don't like to look that way. So people tend to just want to be quiet and get along and think it's all going to blow over and it's not that big a deal. And I think that the most important thing we can do is just keep our gums flapping. Everybody in every context has got to be constantly pointing out, this doesn't make sense. I don't agree with this. This is inconsistent with what I'm supposed to be doing. And if that means making sacrifices and getting uncomfortable, then so be it.
Yeah, sometimes the uncomfortable aspects of it include losing your jobs. I remember a while ago, when social media was really rocking back about 10 years ago, people were getting fired from jobs for saying this or that. And it still happens actually quite a bit. I see it from time to time on Twitter, people discussing, somebody tweeted out, for instance, in the conflict between Israel and Hamas, there's firings going on in academia for what people said on social media. That's why I'm wondering whether it's getting worse or it's getting better. Every time I think it's getting better, I turn around and I see something like that. Regardless of what side of the issue you're on, people getting fired for talking does seem odd, or it does seem sort of contrary to our, small L liberal society.
Yeah, I would sort of push back on that a bit. There's this concept of cancel culture, and then there's this idea that, the right likes to cancel too, and I'm sure that's true. But to me, cancel culture is about having somebody canceled for something that really they shouldn't be canceled for. If somebody runs into a room and sprays the place with bullets and that's their form of expression, I hope that they're canceled from everything, including just basic personal freedom. right? So cancellation is appropriate in some venues, but I think the problem with cancel culture becomes if the power of cancellation is being used by somebody with power in a political way, then it becomes a real problem. But I think that if somebody dissents in some way, but in doing so, says something defamatory, they ought to be responsible for that defamation, or says something irresponsible that causes harm, they ought to be responsible for that. So I'm not as fussed about, cancel culture writ large. More it's classic understanding, which is canceling of people for having the wrong ideas.
Oh, okay. So you're making something of a distinction there. And
yeah.
Which
muddies it a bit, unfortunately,
yeah.
But
well, of course we have the law to consider, as you pointed out, with defamation laws and the like. So that does still come into play, whether it's on social media or in a newspaper, I assume. Well, I wanted to explore the topic of the utility of dissent, the use of it. We are defending it, of course. Why is it beneficial?
Good question. I'd say that it's beneficial in lots of different sort of broad and narrow respects. So broadly speaking, we live in a democracy, and that means that you have to, well, you don't have to, but you have the privilege of deciding what your laws are going to be that you're subject to through the legislature. And that system does not operate properly if you don't have dissent, because if you just have a monotheistic censor telling everyone what to say and think, then you're not making a choice. Instead of consent, you have manufactured consent. So democracy depends on dissent. In the medical profession, science depends on consent, or dissent, I should say. Obviously, because the scientific process is basically characterized as proposing theories that are falsifiable, meaning there ought to be some way to prove this wrong through data and analysis, and then an attempt to disprove your own theory. And then if you can't disprove your theory, you say, well, I haven't disproven my theory, so maybe I've happened upon some sort of fact. I wouldn't call it a fact quite, but I've landed on some truth. And then others can look at that and say, no, you didn't do the trial correctly. You didn't double blind. You released the double blind too early. There's a fault in the way you're measuring something. I mean, and so then they'll poke at it and say, you haven't proven that thing. And then maybe you go, oh, well, those are some good points. So now I'm going to refine my experiment and I'm going to try again. Or those parties will say, I'm going to refine your experiment for you and try it again. Aha, I've disproven your theory. I mean, so back and forth, that process of dissent is entirely what drives the scientific process. So as soon as you don't have dissent, as Russia discovered under communism and China did, scientific progress ceases immediately. So unless you steal science like China now does, it stagnates, right? And I would say that as I understand it, the Chinese communists are careful to insulate certain sectors of their society from censorship, and science to some extent is one of those, meaning they recognize that they can't, they're not going to get any technological progress if they censor dissent or make propaganda the sort of, the operating manual for science. So they insulate science to some extent from communism and the ideology of communism so that science can advance, which is just to show that even commies understand that without dissent, you don't have science. And then, doctors have other good reasons to dissent, and this came out in our hearing in McInnes. So this is the Leah McInnes file in Saskatchewan, where Miss McInnes had been charged by the College of Registered Nurses of Saskatchewan of misinformation for her participation in opposition and dissent to vaccine mandates. The medicine depends I mean, basically, doctors want to be ethical and patients want doctors who are ethical. Medical ethics isn't something that's just handed down on golden tablets. It's something that, is basically understood through a process of self-reflection and constantly updating. And so, for those reasons, we've progressed from, a bygone era when informed consent was not really a thing to where informed consent is now really the essence of medical ethics. And so, in Miss McInnes's situation, for example, she was saying, look, it's unethical for us to be mandating vaccines. And why is it unethical for us to be mandating vaccines? And she had a number of reasons why it was unethical. Well, I mean, I personally think she was right. Many Canadians think she was right. I think history has borne out that the whole thesis for why it was okay to override those ethics has been proven false. In other words, mandates didn't work. They didn't control the spread. And therefore, overriding the ethics of informed consent and personal autonomy, wasn't a juice worth the squeeze. In any case, she opposed vaccine mandates, and she was one of very, very few voices in the medical field that did. And so, if it isn't for voices like Miss McInnes, then you can expect medical ethics to just migrate to whatever the herd, determines is moral from one day to the next. And, the medical profession, I think, roundly, probably in early 2021, like a bunch of policymakers, would have completely opposed the idea of vaccine mandates. And somehow that just turned on a dime in about July or August of 2021. And so you need to have the ability for someone like Miss McInnes to say, wait, what are we doing here? And have that conversation so that hopefully you can have a cogent conversation, and hopefully, the rest of the profession can be convinced that there's a problem and maybe we should do things different. So, and then I would say, another kind of local importance of dissent in the legal field is that, and I'd say it's very important. Basically, the legal system is premised on an adversarial legal system. So, you hire a lawyer to help you, and then let's say you're charged with a crime, the government hires a lawyer to help them. Well, the Crown prosecutor who's going to be prosecuting you, their job and interest is, seeing justice done, but let's admit it, they're basically kind of trying to get the conviction. My job, if I'm defending you, is to try not to get you convicted. So we have completely different interests, and I'm right there in that situation, dissenting in a sense. If I go in a courtroom where I can't raise arguments, because I can't raise those arguments that I'd like to raise in defense of you, i.e. dissent in court on your behalf, then we don't have an adversarial legal system anymore. And if we don't have an adversarial legal system, then eventually you get to the point where the charge is the conviction.
Right. Well, that's the courtroom, though. Excuse me. If you're writing a column somewhere and they find you out of bounds, like the Law Society, does that fit under the same adversarial system? I mean, I'm just wondering about the benefit of being able to speak your mind or rely on free expression in the legal field in particular, because it's so opinionated. Does it change when it moves outside the courtroom?
Yeah. I mean, I'd say the reasons, there's lots of good reasons for lawyers to be able to dissent. I'm trying to provide one, which is the adversarial legal system.
Right.
Another one, to your point, is more broadly, lawyers ought to be able to talk about things in a dissenting fashion because, one of the lawyers are, like it or not, or I call them basically operators of the legal system. So they have privileged knowledge about the way the legal system works and the way the legal system doesn't work, the ways that we have problems with the legal system. So you need lawyers, I think lawyers need the freedom to be able to point out a problem and say, hey, that's a problem. That's not fair. Here's a situation where people, for example, it takes 3 years to get to a trial and it costs $120,000. Well, you can't, for most people, that's completely, impossible. So that's a serious problem of access to justice. You can have legal systems, but if you don't have the ability to enforce your legal rights in that legal system, you might as well not have legal rights. So lawyers may see a problem like an access to justice issue and ought to be able to dissent and say, this isn't fair, something should be done. And likewise, a lawyer in my situation that sees my law society for, encouraging me to become woke, I think that I'm sure the fact that if I can't dissent and I can't try to do something about that and convince people that I'm right, that that's a serious problem, then we're just going to walk into whatever future that holds for us. And, I think it's a dark future. So, yeah, lots of good reasons for lawyers to be able to dissent. Plus, lawyers are humans. We live in a democracy, and lawyers outside of their role as lawyers for clients ought to be able to exercise the same, civic rights that other people can, subject to some limitations because they're lawyers, and with that comes certain responsibilities. But generally speaking, people outside of their workplace should be given fairly wide latitude to participate in liberal democracy just like anyone else.
Okay. Well, you may have answered this question already somewhat by addressing the whole adversarial system, but I would like to hear briefly how the lack of dissent or the inability to dissent affects the rule of law, that is the equal application of the law. Does it, first of all, and how, if it does?
Yeah, it does. It's a it's a bit of a tricky question, just to tie it to dissent exactly, but I would say that, well, first of all, the adversarial legal system, if we just take that as an example, there's lots of different ways. I'm just thinking this through. The adversarial legal system, again, if we want to characterize my ability to get up in court and say some unpopular things as a form of dissent on behalf of a client, then the rule of law depends on my ability to do that. Because, again, if you're charged with, let's say you're charged with a crime, rule of law says that, okay, we read that law and it has some objective meaning. And then somebody's going to try to prove that Kevin broke that law, and somebody's going to try to prove that Kevin didn't break that law, right? If I'm hamstrung and censored in my ability to say that you didn't break the law, then you're more likely all of a sudden to be found to have broken that law, right? And so now, instead of being judged on the basis of whether or not you actually broke the law, right? You're being judged you're being judged instead based on what incentives are happening in the courtroom around the law, but not in the law itself. So instead of the law dictating the outcome of that hearing, all of these other, I would say, perverse incentives are going to dictate the outcome of that hearing. So instead of the law being in charge, people are in charge, right? Powerful interests that aren't me and aren't you sitting in that courtroom like helpless, lambs. Those other powers are determining whether or not you're going to be convicted of something, not what the law says. So in that respect, it violates the rule of law. And then the other thing I would say is that outside of the courtroom, it can affect you as well. So, to take, a solicitor, a lawyer who writes contracts and all that kind of stuff, not a courtroom lawyer. If you have some legal problem, you're going to go to a lawyer and you're going to ask for advice on that legal problem. If the lawyer can't give you certain advice because they're being censored, or doesn't give you certain advice because they think that, that advice is unethical or something like that, then you're not going to hear from your lawyer what your actual legal rights are based on the law as written by the legislature. Instead, you're going to be sold a bill of goods. You're not going to be told the full story. Often you'll find that if you go to a lawyer, sometimes you go to a lawyer and you say, well, how can I get this thing done? And the guy says, you can't, forget it. Okay. And you think, I don't like this lawyer. So then you go to another lawyer, and the other lawyer says, okay, well, yeah, there's a way we can do this. How about we do this, blah, blah, blah. So you go get second opinions. So the, variety in the legal industry is great for clients, because then clients can, make sure that they find a lawyer who actually, is serving their interests, and a lawyer that, is able to do and willing to do what the client wants to do. I mean, within certain parameters, lawyers can't cheat and steal and stuff. But if, and this might be stretching the definition of dissent, but if lawyers are all told by a regulator that, some fact about the law is, verboten to discuss with clients, then even though that there may be some legal redress, or that there may be, some aspect of the law that would be to the client's benefit, if you're being censored, and so you can't talk to your client about that thing, then it doesn't matter who they go to. They're not going to be able to get real advice about the law. And again, the rule of law doesn't operate very well if people don't know what the law is, right?
Right.
And the rule of law doesn't protect people if they can't find somebody to tell them, how does it protect me here? So the rule of law depends on lawyers that, are keenly interested in knowing exactly what the law is, and then helping clients understand exactly what possible ways they can use that to their benefit.
Right. Serving their clients and not the new master of wokeness or whatever it happens to be at that time.
Right.
Okay, great.
And I would add that as important as dissent is right now, if we continue on the path that we're going, where we're, I think, causing professionals to become more woke and to take this new world view, then the new problem we might have is that people just don't want to dissent. There is no dissent.
Well, thanks very much, Glenn, for giving us your thoughts on this professional dissent issue. I know it's going to be going on for a few years, and I'm glad you're in the ring on this. Okay, great. Well, I hope to talk to you soon.
Okay, thanks very much.